Yeah.
Okay, well, my computer now says it's 6:30. Welcome, everybody. We are recording this session. You folks are not recorded in any way, shape, or form. You're entirely anonymous and unphotographed. Just us as panelists are going to be on the video along with the presentation. Okay. Welcome to our amazing partnership with the Vancouver Island Regional Library and the Vancouver Island Master Gardeners Association. This has been one of my favorite parts of my job for several years because I'm really proud of what we've been able to create together and the amazing depth of knowledge and generosity of the Master Gardeners in sharing what they know and looking into your questions when they don't know, and they answer so many questions. It always just impresses the heck out of me. We've got Deborah Grad coming back. She has much higher standards for herself than probably others do. She didn't like her first thing on pruning, which was one of the best sessions that we'd recorded at that point. And so she's revised and expanded it. So hopefully we're really impressed, which I'm sure we will be. Um, Deborah's got many years of great experience in the Master Gardeners. I'll just tell you a little bit more about her. She's been interested in growing things since watching her parents in their garden and begging for her own little patch as a child. Her love of plants was really sparked by a botany class at university, and she's been gardening at every opportunity since. She first learned about master gardeners over 20 years ago after moving to Vancouver Island in 2017, was finally able to take the training and become certified. Her special interests are pruning, root prep for successful transplanting, which she did a session on, which is in the archive. We'll drop it in the chat, and food gardening. She's a retired high school teacher and counselor who still loves to teach, so often gives workshops and presentations on gardening topics from Campbell River to Nanaimo, which would be in person. And by the way, her 93-year-old mom was still puttering in her garden until recently. So I think she's got lots of years left of gardening. Deborah, can I turn it over to you? Oh, I need to talk about the chat. Sorry.
Okay.
Folks who are in the room, please put your clarifying questions in the chat, comments, chime in the chat. It's our best way to make this as interactive as possible, but save your big meaty questions for the Q&A. You can find the Q&A icon on the bottom there, and then we'll save those for after Deborah's presentation, which will be about an hour, and then she'll get into all of those questions. But Dorothy and Jill can answer clarifying questions in the chat, and then maybe tell you if your question is too big for the chat and put it in the Q&A. I think that's it.
Okay.
Sorry, Deborah, it's your turn now.
Oh, that's fine. We're ready to go then.
Okay,
Okay.
and Dorothy and Jill and I are just going to mute ourselves.
Okay.
Oh,
First
okay.
order of business is to read all the legality stuff. This seminar is the property of the Vancouver Island Regional Library, Vancouver Island Master Gardeners Association, and is intended for education purposes only. Commercial use of all or part of this seminar or its contents is prohibited without express written consent from the Vancouver Island Master Gardeners Association and the Vancouver Island Regional Library. The information in this seminar is science-based and is accurate to the best of VIMGA's knowledge. Use of information in this seminar is at the sole discretion, responsibility, and liability of the user. The Vancouver Island Master Gardeners Association, VIMGA, is a chapter of the Master Gardeners Association of British Columbia, MGABC, a member of an international service organization of specially trained volunteer teachers dedicated to stewardship of the environment. Master gardeners work in partnership with public sector agencies, garden clubs, nonprofit service organizations, and private enterprise to teach and promote science-based sustainable horticultural knowledge and methods. Some images and information are from internet sources. These are labeled or cited, and we thank the persons and companies for their use in this nonprofit educational seminar. Hello, and welcome everyone to the updated and expanded basics of pruning. For those of you who watched my original Pruning Basics presentation 3 years ago, I think there will be enough expanded and new information, as well as a lot more pictures to make this worth your while tonight. And for the newbies in the crowd, welcome. One of my missions as a master gardener is to help stop the torture and malpruning of trees and shrubs, so I'm glad you're here. Any first-time or nervous pruners out there? This was me many years ago when I was very interested in pruning, but I knew nothing about the right methods. I pruned a lot of things badly, even killed a few, but I kept learning, which is why I am here tonight. While there will be many specialized types of pruning that I won't have time to touch on, like fruit trees, pollarding, grapevines, and roses, to name just a few, my goal is that you come away with a good foundation of basic pruning principles as a starting point for your learning. Let's start with why we prune. When you think about all the plants in the wild that manage to do just fine without human help, it becomes clear that plants have no inherent need to be pruned, and they have clearly evolved over millennia to survive and thrive on their own. The obvious answer then is that we prune mostly to meet our needs and desires for the plant. To put it very simply, we prune plants for their health by removing dead, diseased, and damaged wood, which can all act as pathways for disease to get into the plant. We prune for the safety of people and structures. We train young trees by pruning to correct defects and help shape them for good health and function. This is called structural pruning. We prune for aesthetics, including the shape of a plant, as well as to encourage interesting foliage or more blooms. We also prune for fruit production, both size and amount of fruit, as well as its accessibility. And we prune to control size. Just a side note on that, as master gardeners, we strive always to teach right plant, right place. And I'm saddened when I see people buying a plant either ignorant of its mature size or thinking they will just prune it to keep it the size they want. This sets up an endless battle between them wanting the plant to be smaller and the genetics of the plant striving to make itself its inherent size. Much better for both you and the plant to purchase with the mature size in mind. Even though we believe we have very good reasons to prune, in fact, pruning is wounding. So always keep in mind that you should prune only what is necessary. Plants do not heal from pruning in the same way humans heal wounds, but they do have a rather marvelous mechanism for sealing pruning wounds, which I will explain a bit later. This tree was very badly pruned, and those wounds will never seal, the reasons for which we will get into later as well. Given that pruning is wounding, it is always better to prune when plants are young and cuts will be small, in order to avoid later making big wounds that take much longer to seal, and in the meantime, leave the plant open to disease. Proper training of a young plant will avoid the need for large renovation pruning cuts later. This is called structural pruning and is important, particularly for young fruit trees, but I won't have time to get into the specifics of it tonight. Most deciduous trees and shrubs are best pruned while they are dormant, but can also take light pruning anytime. There are, however, best times to prune different plants based on the following. The growth habit of the plant. Is it deciduous or evergreen? Is it vining? Is it a woody perennial? Is it a woody perennial that gets frost damage every winter? Is it a cane grower or a multi-stemmed shrub? The season in which plants bloom is another factor in when to prune. For instance, you probably don't want to be pruning your forsythia in January because you will be cutting off all the flower buds that would have opened in early spring. These kinds of plants are best pruned after flowering. Another consideration is the type of flowering wood. Does it bloom on new growth, last year's growth, or old wood? Knowing this will help you avoid cutting off the flower buds before they get a chance to bloom. In our climate, with rain and damp during most of the year, funguses can be rampant, so plants such as stone fruits that are particularly susceptible should be pruned only in the dry months like August and September to lessen the possibility of infection. To help gardeners know when it is the best time to prune, the Royal Horticultural Society has defined 13 pruning groups to which they have assigned all woody plants that require pruning, as well as 8 groups just for the different types of roses. Each pruning group explains the type of plant assigned to it, the type of pruning best suited for those plants, and the best time of year to do the pruning. It's a simple matter to look up on the RHS website which pruning group pretty much any woody plant or rose belongs to to get an idea of best pruning practices for that plant. Here's an example of the information from pruning groups 1 and 4. Now notice group 1, up at the top, it gives you a list of a few species of plants included. And then it also says the type of plant, evergreen, deciduous trees, etc. And action, it tells you what kind of pruning you will do. And then when tells you the best time to prune. So group 1, Acer palmatum, that's Japanese maples. Magnolias are included. And then the one on the right is group 4, Hydrangea macrophylla. Those are deciduous shrubs that flower in mid or late summer to autumn on the previous year's growth. Tells you how to prune them and when to prune. Most plants have a pruning budget of 10 to 15% of the plant, which means don't remove more than that in any one growing season. Some of you will notice that I am recommending a lower percentage than previously and will be wondering why. Recent research has shown that our former recommendation for a 25 to 30% pruning budget may be too high. Plants have a genetically predetermined size and also rely on their leaves photosynthesizing to make food. Pruning too much sets up a cycle of the plant trying to replace what was removed in order to try to attain that predetermined size, as well as replacing the food factory necessary for it to maintain itself. Different plants, however, can withstand different amounts and kinds of pruning without suffering. If the pruner overdoes it, punishment will usually be in the form of dieback, because too much was removed for the plant's survival, or water sprouts, which is the plant's overzealous attempt to put back the food-producing ability of what was pruned off. I'm sure you've all seen trees that have been pruned and have lots of water sprouts. Some plants react badly to taking as little as 5 to 10%, such as witch hazel, which usually responds to light pruning with an abundance of water sprouts and suckers, and Daphne, which resents being disturbed in any way and may sulk. So you need to kind of research and figure out which plants are very, very sensitive to pruning and really prune them very, very lightly. Other plants, on the other hand, will bounce back just fine if cut right to the ground, which is true for many multi-stemmed shrubs and cane growers like hydrangea and forsythia and berries. Too bad the pruning budget isn't posted right on the trees and shrubs, but you can learn by research and careful observation of the results of your efforts how much to prune each plant. Here is a tree that was pruned way more than its pruning budget. Now let's talk about tools. Hand pruners and loppers are the workhorses in your pruning toolbox. Because they are going to be your go-to tools, I always recommend getting the best quality you can afford. A well-made tool will do a better job for a longer period of time, so you actually save money in the long run by not having to place them, as well as not damaging your plants. Small pruners will make clean cuts on branches up to about a 1/2 inch. For branches between 1/2 inch and 1 inch, you should use loppers, making sure the branch fits entirely within its bite to get a clean cut. Anything bigger, you should use a pruning saw, which is designed especially for clean cuts on live wood. Before I go on, just want to let everybody know that this coming fall, I forget which month exactly, but it'll be on the library website. We're going to have one of these presentations titled Tools, Tools, and More Tools, and we're going to talk about all the different garden tools. There are 2 blade types for both pruners and loppers. The bypass blade is where the cutting blade bypasses the non-cutting blade, as you can see in this little diagram here. The branch is that yellowy green thing, and then the part of the blade with the stripes on it, that's the cutting part. And then underneath that is the anvil that it slides by when it cuts. Bypass blades are best for clean cuts on live wood. You will see in this drawing that the entire crush zone will be in the discarded portion of the pruned branch. The other kind of cutting blade is the anvil, where the cutting blade meets the non-cutting blade. And you can see in the picture here that the blade comes right up against the anvil. This is best for really hard or dead wood, since the crush zone is on both sides of the cut, which is damaging for soft live wood. You've probably heard that we should always disinfect our tools between plants, something I still do, even though recently there has been information that it's probably not helping that much. First of all, there's no good evidence that pathogens are being carried on the metal blades of your tool. But more importantly, many pathogens are mostly already in the air anyway and will land on the new cut regardless of what you do to the tools. Given that, I will probably still continue to disinfect my tools between plants, but at the very least, at the end of a day's work. When pruning plants with evidence of disease, you spray between cuts so you don't move the disease from one part of the plant to another. I use a spray bottle of isopropyl alcohol, which is just plain old rubbing alcohol, which is an inexpensive, effective disinfectant. You actually, for those of you who have a Costco membership, you can buy a case of like 8 bottles of alcohol for fairly inexpensive to use for your disinfecting needs. Bleach is also an excellent disinfectant, but it will corrode your tools over time, so I don't recommend it. Lysol is also an effective disinfectant, but if you don't mind the smell. Some people use disinfecting wipes to clean the blades, but I am unsure that the disinfectant actually kind of gets down into the cracks and crevices of the tool. And plus, I don't like adding more stuff to landfills, so I don't use them. Now let's talk about the actual process of pruning, getting into the meat of everything here. There are 2 basic pruning cuts, heading cuts and branch removal cuts, and each has its appropriate uses. The primary difference between them is the plant's response. Heading cuts remove a portion of a shoot or branch, leaving only lateral or side buds, resulting in an increased number of branches, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. A branch removal cut removes branches back to their point of origin, which could be a larger branch, or it could be the trunk, or in the case of a multi-stem shrub, it's going to be at ground level at the root ball. And this results in a reduced number of branches. I'm going to explain why, as well as the different types of both cuts, along with the proper use of each. The first pruning cut I'm going to talk about, and the one most commonly misused by novice pruners, is the non-selective heading cut, which just means whacking back a branch to no place in particular. This type of cut changes the growth pattern of the plant by redirecting the plant's resources from growth of the buds at the tips to growth of the lateral buds, usually resulting in an increased number of branches, often in an unattractive cluster. Pruning stimulates the buds left on the branch to grow, so when you snip the tip of a branch, 3 to 6 new branches takes its place. Now, if you're interested in why this happens, there's the growing bud at the tip of the branch secretes a plant hormone, an auxin, that flows down the branch that inhibits the growth of those buds along the branch. And when you clip that tip off, that hormone is no longer present. So then those lateral buds can start to grow. And that's why you get the explosion of growth in the lateral buds. Many people use heading cuts in an effort to control the size of a plant, when in reality, the plant desperately trying to replace the lost leaves that produce its food results in an explosion of growth, and the plant ends up as big or bigger than it was before it was pruned. I like this little drawing here that shows you where the cuts are made on the left, and then on the right, you can see that at least 3 buds grew for each heading cut that was made. But the plant is the same size and even a bit bigger than it was. Okay, so here are a couple examples of what non-selective heading cuts do. The little drawing on the left, if you look at this carefully, you can see that this has probably been almost like a hedge cut, like a sheared across the whole plant, probably successive years in a row. It started when the plant was smaller, because you can see all the places where it branched. And then those extra branches then were sheared off again. And then each of those had an explosion of growth. if you keep doing this with a plant like this every year, you keep shearing it like that, pretty soon you end with many, many, many little tiny twigs of growth rather than sturdy branches, and the leaves will also be quite small. This picture on the right, I think is really a fun one. The red arrow is pointing to the spot on the branch where it was had a heading cut. The branch was just lopped off. And if you count all of those stems that grew from buds, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, there's 9 buds that then exploded in growth. And so you have this shape on this plant that is very unattractive and crowded. Okay. Now, here are some examples of non-selective heading cuts. The first is shearing, which stimulates bushy regrowth, creating a twiggy outer shell on many plants, which shades the interior, causing dieback. It's appropriate for hedges, but even there, it is still high maintenance and difficult to keep the plant the same size year after year. Now, this picture shows you that when you prune a hedge, you really need to prune it wider at the bottom than at the top, because if the bottom is narrower, then all the light is blocked and you're going to have a lot of dieback, and then you'll only have green growth near the top. Okay. Shearing is also appropriate for lavender, woody herbs, rock rose, heaths, and heathers. I have a lot of fun every year getting out with my husband's little electric shearing tool and taking it to all the heaths and heathers in my yard. That's really fun to do. Okay, so here are some examples of bad non-selective heading cuts. This is before and after of the same tree, where the explosion of growth around the pruning cuts is obvious and has definitely changed the natural growth habit of the tree. In fact, if you look on the left, you can see that these cuts have been made several years in a row. It started with just whacking the ends off, and then the ends had a burst of that growth of the lateral buds. And then those became branches, but then those have been cut off. You see, those have all now been chopped off. So those are all going to make tiny branches. So when you look over at the picture on the right, you've got a tree that has lots and lots of branches that are very crowded close together, blocking air, blocking light, and they're also weak and small. And the same for this shrub, resulting in a very crowded and unattractive plant. Now, this is a textbook case of just whack that thing back in no place in particular. And you can see the way it all grew back with this profusion of buds that grew because the tips were cut off. And it's not attractive. It's crowded. It's blocking air and light. And those are all weakly attached. And it's not the natural growth habit of the plant. The plant will look different than it should. And a couple more examples showing how the trees ended up growing back most, if not all, of the height that had been pruned off. So the one on the left, you can see that one of the trunks that was cut here was quite large, but all the branches that came off of it, and there's, I don't know, 6, 8, 12 of them there, they're teeny tiny. So again, this is not the natural growth habit of the plant. And then the one on the left, I see this a lot in urban trees and street trees, and they just, somebody thinks the tree is too big, so they come along and do what I call lollipopping, which is just, cutting it all back, thinking, well, I need this tree to be smaller. But all the growth that gets put back is just as big as the tree was to begin with, and maybe bigger, but now you've got a multitude of these tiny weak stems. Okay, the next non-selective heading cut is tree topping. It's just shortening a tree with a big non-selective heading cut, and it usually has disastrous long-term results for both the health and the aesthetics of the tree. To quote Cass Turnbull in her book, Guide to Pruning, topping causes rot to enter the tree trunk, which shortens the life of the tree, creates dangerous weakened trunks, and stimulates water sprouts, which are weakly attached and will be prone to breakage. Besides all that, a top tree is ugly. Tree topping has been likened to tree butchery, so please just say no to tree topping. And here's a diagram of what happens to a tree that has been topped. You can see the center trunk was topped, and all the branches were also had non-selective heading cuts. And then all these teeny tiny little branches that just grew out of all of those cuts. This tree is now going to be open to rot and disease from all those big wounds. All those tiny branches are not the natural growth habit of the tree. It's changed its form and its shape entirely, and it will not probably survive. And here is a longitudinal, that means from top to bottom, section of a topped tree showing how rot got into the trunk. So that center dark patch, that's all the inside of the tree all rotted. And that cream colored that goes off to the left, those are a couple of those branches from the buds underneath the cut that sprouted and grew and made branches. But you see how they're attached just on the outside of the tree here. Here are some more results of tree topping. The one on the left, I think, it's been topped multiple times. You can see all of it started with a topping and then maybe 3 or 4 branches, and then those were topped, and then they each had 3 or 4 branches, and now there's such a multitude of branches. I mean, it's just sad because it'll probably eventually kill the tree, but it's also really ugly. The one on the right, the picture on the right, you can see all of the same things you saw in all the rest, but you can also see the rot in the center. Part of this tree is still alive, but the branch going straight up is dead. And then if you look on the trunk going straight kind of down, you can see evidence of rot that's moving down the trunk. So that tree is probably going to die soon. Okay, remember the quote from Cass Turnbull saying that tree topping results in weakly attached branches that are prone to breakage? When you look at these pictures, you can see why. These clusters of branches that grew after the heading cuts were made are attached only at the outside of the trunk, rather than from the inside, like a branch that arose from a bud and grew with the tree. This weak attachment will be prone to breaking off as these branches get bigger and heavier. Now, not only are these branches all attached on the outside, as you can see, but you can also see that the big gaping hole at the top of the trunk that's going to result in rot getting right down through into the trunk. Now let's talk about selective heading cut, which is just what it sounds like. This heading cut is usually done one branch at a time when you actually want to stimulate growth in the lateral buds. The place of each cut is deliberately chosen just above a bud, and the heights of the stems left after pruning are usually staggered to avoid a sheared look. Growth is redirected based on the location of the remaining buds, usually up and out, so pay close attention to where you make each cut, choosing a spot that is just past a bud that is facing the direction that you want the new growth to go. If you're doing selective heading, like say on a shrub, let's pick forsythia, for instance. If you cut a branch because you want it shorter, make sure that the bud that you're leaving is pointing to the outside of the plant. You don't want to leave the top bud pointing to the inside because you want the branches to grow up and out. Okay, think heading back your hydrangeas in the spring, like this drawing right here. This could be a hydrangea or a spirea or lots of other different kinds of shrubs. Each of those is a selective heading cut, those little black marks, where you've whacked off a branch, but you haven't done them all the same length. And you see that the result is that the plant is smaller, and each stem has a bud that is now going to grow in the direction that you want. Pruning your roses is an example of tip pruning, even though it's really more than the tip if you've got a long stem or something, depends on the kind of rose. But that's an example of a selective heading cut. And then the other one is pinching out the growing tips of something like young chrysanthemums or to make more flowers, or your pepper plants because you want more peppers, you want more blooms. And here's a chart that shows proper and improper heading cuts The proper one on the left is a 45-degree angle. And notice that the angle is higher on the side where the bud is. It kind of protects the bud a little bit. So you don't ever want to have your angle cutting down toward the bud. You want it up so the bud's underneath the highest spot. You don't want the cut to be too big, too angular, because you're making a bigger wound, which is a bigger surface area for pathogens to get into the stem. The next one shows a cut that's too low. It's low enough that you might be compromising that bud, which you don't want to do. When the cut is too high, you're going to have a stub left over that is going to die back. It will be unattractive. It will also be a better pathway for disease into the plant than a proper cut. And then the picture on the right shows how to make a good cut on a plant that has the buds grow opposite of each other, like your hydrangeas. The buds are opposite, or on a maple tree, the buds are opposite. So anything that has buds opposite like that, you're going to make a flat cut and you're going to go above the buds like that. But don't leave a big peg. You need to get down as close as you can. The second type of pruning cut after the heading cut is the branch removal cut, which was formerly called the thinning cut. My last presentation on pruning, I called it the thinning cut, but that's sort of been changed now out in the literature. This cut removes an entire branch back to its point of attachment, which can be another larger branch, the trunk, or at ground level for multi-stem shrubs and cane growers. A branch removal cut opens up a plant to light, which allows more leaves to photosynthesize and make food for the plant while preventing dieback in the interior. And it also opens the plant up to airflow, which helps prevent disease. If you have good airflow around your plant, then the diseases that are in the air, which are generally going to be funguses where we live, will not find as good of environment to attach and settle and start growing, because the airflow will not allow them to do that. Branch removal cuts do not remove just the growing tip of the branch, so do not cause that explosion of growth in the lateral buds like heading cuts do, but instead the growth, the resources that used to go to that tip are now redirected to another branch's growing tip. So if you look at this little drawing here, let's take the big branch that was removed in the middle. Notice it was cut back clear to its point of attachment to a bigger branch. But what's left, if you watch the path of resources coming up the trunk, up from the roots, now those resources are going to go off to the right to that other branch. But you haven't cut a growing tip off in any way that's going to stimulate those lateral buds to make those explosions of growth. What branch removal cuts also do very well is help maintain the natural shape and growth habit of the plant. You notice in this little drawing right here that even with these branches gone, this plant is still going to have the same growth habit and still going to be recognizable. A good rule for branch removal cuts is to never take off a branch larger than 10 centimeters or 4 inches in diameter, because the bigger the wound, the longer it will take to seal. Here are diagrams of a couple of plants that have been pruned using branch removal cuts. The branch removal cuts, by the way, are really going to be for trees in particular, and for a lot of shrubs as well. They're going to be your workhorse cut. You're going to use them more than selective heading cuts. So you can see this picture on the left. They've got the branches that they removed and that are sort of paled out with dotted lines, and then the red lines are where the cuts were made. So what's left after all this excess is cut out is the same growth pattern, the same growth habit, but now there's airflow and there's light to the interior. This sort of pruning also works really well on trees. In fact, it's the very best way to prune a tree. You take the crowded growth on the inside that's blocking the light to the interior. Often inside of your tree, if it's really crowded like that, there'll be a lot of dieback. These little branches will sprout and leaf out on the inside, but the light's blocked because of all the leaves on the outside, so all those will die back. But if you open the plant up to light and air, like in the after picture, then you will have more growth in the interior. Your plant will be healthier as well. Okay, I love this illustration of the different results from heading cuts and branch removal cuts. So you start with the tree on the left. Good pruning shows how you've opened the plant up, but it's still the same shape. It's still recognizable as the same plant. Now the not good over on the right, this is a bit exaggerated, but this tree has been some pretty severe heading cuts, just whacked right back. And then the crazy looking growth, it looks more like an anemone than an actual tree. But it's to give you the idea of what happens. You have this explosion of growth out of these stems that are going to make that tree no longer look like it should. And it's also not going to be as healthy. There is a special type of branch removal cut called the reduction cut, which is made at the end of a branch with the purpose of reducing its length. So think of a branch removal cut that you are taking a branch and going back to cutting it back to a larger branch or the trunk. A reduction cut is much the same, only just on a smaller scale. You're taking the end of a branch and you're cutting it back to the same branch, but all the way back to where it attaches. It's made at the end of a branch with the purpose of reducing its length. It is done by cutting off one of two of its forks, usually the larger. That's different than a branch removal cut as well. You're going to cut off the larger one, and the branch left should be 1/3 to 1/2 the diameter of the branch being cut. Okay, so there'll be a picture of this in just a minute. Reduction cuts are a great way to control the size of a plant by shortening a branch without causing the explosion of growth, like from a heading cut, and without changing the growth habit of the plant. Growth is redirected based on the location of the remaining growing branch tip, usually up and out. Again, you haven't removed, but just relocated the growing tip. So reduction cuts have little effect on the upward flow of plant resources, and the growth pattern of the plant is mostly unchanged. Okay, so here's a picture showing reduction cuts. And on the left, you've got a branch, the larger branch, and then there's a little bit smaller branch coming off to the right. And the intention here is to bring the size of this tree in to make it smaller width. So the first cut over on the right-hand side, they've cut off the bigger of the two branches and left the smaller one. But then they've also made a second cut because there were two branches on that smaller branch, and they've cut off the larger of those as well and left the smaller one. So what you've done is you've cut off two chunks of that branch that were the biggest, and you've left the smaller one. But you still have the growing tip releasing its hormone so that all the lateral buds don't suddenly start to grow. So the plant is still going to grow with its normal growth habit, but you've brought the size in. Okay. Now, here's a comparison of the difference between a branch removal cut and a reduction cut. This will help you to see the difference. A branch removal cut prunes a branch back to the trunk or parent branch, but the removal always takes a smaller branch and cuts it off of something bigger, either a bigger branch or the trunk. Okay? The reduction cut shortens the length of a stem by pruning back to a smaller limb. But in this case, you're cutting off the bigger of the two and leaving the smaller one. Okay, so usually a branch removal cut is going to open up the inside of the plant to air and light, whereas a reduction cut is going to shorten the length of the stems. This is how you control the size. Okay, so this picture is really important for you to understand the difference of the two. Okay, before we talk about the proper way to make a cut, we need a little lesson in the anatomy of a branch. Branch wood is different from trunk wood. Branches on trees arise from lateral buds present in leaf axils. That's the little place where the leaf attaches. If you look at any plant that has leaves on its stems, and you look at the place where the leaf attaches, there's always a tiny little bud in there. And that little bud is usually, if for some reason that growth is stimulated, that will become a branch. Okay, here's a cross section of a trunk showing how the branch originated when the tree was young and then grew with the tree. So you can see the branch started as a little bud when the trunk of that tree was quite small, maybe ½ inch in diameter, an inch or something like that. And then as the tree grew bigger and put down all these rings, the branch also grew with the tree, and the branch also got bigger and bigger. You can see that its diameter gets bigger and bigger as it's growing. And here is a longitudinal, again, up and down section showing the same thing. So the center of this, the gray center that's vertical going up and down, that's the heartwood of the tree. But you can see that the branch originated back when that heartwood was actually the trunk of the tree. That was the whole little tree, was that skinny little trunk. And one of the branches was stimulated to grow, or one of the buds, I'm sorry, grew into a branch. And then as the tree grew in width and girth, so did the branch, but the branch kept following out with the growth of the tree as the branch got bigger. Young branches grow in length and diameter at approximately the same rate as the rest of the plant, but their growth soon slows to a lesser rate than the parent or main stem. Both trunk and branch lay down a new layer of wood every spring, and because of their different growth rates, where these new layers meet, the trunk wood laminates over the branch wood, creating a wrinkly bulge called the branch collar. Now, this picture right here on the right, you can actually see where the wood of the trunk has kind of laminated over the branch wood. The branch collar is trunk wood that is responsible for strengthening the branch for weight bearing and from the effects of wind. The branch collar also contains a protective chemical zone that inhibits the movement of decay organisms from dead to dying branches into healthy tissues by walling them off. This is called compartmentalization. So if you ever see that term in your reading, you'll know what it means. The branch collar also has specialized tissue for sealing the wound made by pruning, which is why we are interested in it. As long as the branch collar is left intact, this special tissue will swell and eventually close over the wound made by pruning. So you can see in this, there's two pictures here, two different trees. You can see all those wrinkles kind of at the bottom underneath the branch and going up and around and over. That's the branch collar on both of these. Okay, it's pretty obvious in both of those pictures what the branch collar is. The bark on the trunk and the bark on a branch also meet in the crotch, forming the branch bark ridge. Now that you can see the arrows pointing to the branch bark ridge, two of them here in this picture. Together with the branch collar, the portion of the ridge pushed up in the union provides our target for the pruning cut. Identification of the branch bark ridge and branch collar are vital to severing the branch in a place that facilitates fast and effective wound closure, reducing decay in the location of the cut. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to make a proper cut. First thing is you're going to cut parallel to the branch collar, but you're not going to cut into it or into the branch bark ridge because damaging them impedes the branch collar's ability to swell and completely close the wound, leaving it open to allow pathogens into the plant. Years ago, it was fashionable to do flush cuts when pruning. Now we know that just irreparably damages the branch collar and prevents the tree from sealing the wound. So you cut parallel to the collar, but also not too far out, which would leave a stub and also prevent the wound from closing. I see a lot of stubs left by people who were nervous about getting too close to the trunk when pruning. Here are some examples of good wound sealing after a proper cut. So you can see all of these, that sort of little donut shape ring of tissue around a hole. That's the branch collar, that those special cells have swollen and grown, and they're growing toward the center to close that wound. And the picture in the middle of the screen, there are two pruning cuts here that were made, and those are both now closed up. Those wounds are completely closed. Here's another picture showing good pruning cuts closing up. The one on the left is approximately 2 years after pruning. These are two different trees, by the way. And the one on the right is approximately 3 years after pruning. Next, I have pictures of a crabapple tree in my garden that the top third was broken off from heavy snow a few years ago. I trimmed up the jagged break and left it, hoping it would be okay, but was doubtful given the exposed location of the trunk of the cut because it's pointing straight up, right, where all this rain's going to fall on it. To my surprise, as you can see in this picture, the tree has been trying valiantly to close the wound, even though the cut was on the trunk and there was no branch collar. Unfortunately, this spring, I noticed the long split in the bark of the trunk, so I am afraid that because the cut was flat and exposed to rain, rot has gotten into the trunk, and this poor tree is probably a goner. But what a lesson in the innate defense mechanisms in trees that the trunk improvised a branch collar in an attempt to close this wound. Okay, and here are some examples of bad wound sealing caused by damage to the branch collar during pruning. These wounds will never seal completely. The one on the left, the top and the bottom of the branch collar were damaged or completely cut away, and the parts that are left on the two sides are trying to, the cells are swelling and they're trying, but they're never going to be able to completely close the wound. The one on the right, it was the left side of the branch collar that was damaged or cut away completely, and the rest of it is, it's trying to close that wound, but it will never, never close it completely. And here's what happens when you leave a stub. The branch wood is dead. It is blocking the branch collar from closing the wound, and the decaying branch wood is a perfect pathway for disease to get into the tree. Now that you know that stubs are bad, it's a good idea to have a look around your own garden and cut off any stubs you find from previous pruning. So the picture on the left, it's a little hard to see what the stub looks like, but it's right in the middle. It looks like a little round plug. You can kind of see it. And all the rest of that tissue around there, this is a cherry tree in a tree about a block away from my house. This is all sort of infested with a fungus because it was an open wound and because cherry trees are really prone to fungus in our climate. But you can also see on the right of the stub, there's a sort of a lighter colored little crescent shaped thing. That's the branch collar trying to swell so that it could close that wound. But it's never going to happen. It's just going to be a mess and it's going to just get worse. The one in the middle always makes me laugh because wow, I think it's just funny. And then the one on the right shows another. The branch collar wasn't damaged at all. You can see that it's trying to close over the wound, but that stub is left in the middle. It's just like a plug that's just preventing it from closing. But what if I can't see the branch collar? Remember that sometimes it looks no different than the rest of the trunk, making it hard to decide where to make the cut. So on both of these pictures, there's no wrinkly bit underneath that branch. You know, it just kind of all looks the same. So it's like, oh, where do I make the cut? So in that case, we look at the bark ridge and we use the angle it forms with the vertical edge of the tree. In this case, that angle is between the red solid line and the pink dotted line. So you see that red solid line, that's the angle of the branch bark ridge. And then you swing over and you do a sort of eyeball, a vertical line. And the angle between those two lines, you are going to replicate that angle. I always visualize just taking an angle, kind of flipping it over onto across the pink line. So you're going to replicate that angle from the vertical outward, and that will indicate the line where you should make your cut, which in this case is the red dotted line. If I'm working on a tree with a hidden branch collar and I'm trying to eyeball this angle, I will sometimes use a permanent marker to draw the line before I cut just to make sure I get it right. Because you can stand there and you can eyeball it and you go, oh, I'm supposed to cut here. But then as soon as you sort of start to cut, you kind of forget exactly where it is. So drawing that line can be very helpful. Have you ever had this happen when pruning a large, heavy branch? The weight of the branch pulls down and tears the bark before you can complete the cut. And now you've just made a giant wound along the bottom of that branch. So what you're going to do is you're going to use the 3-step method on any branch larger than 2 inches in diameter to prevent this kind of damage from the bark tearing. The first is an undercut to about 1/4 the thickness of the branch. Next, cut the entire branch off outside of the undercut to remove all the weight. Lastly, make your pruning cut parallel to the branch collar, just like you would for any old branch. Now let's talk about the sequence of steps before both before pruning and during the actual pruning, which will be pretty universal across all plant types that need pruning. First, decide what is your objective for pruning this plant. Is it aesthetics? Is it training a young tree for a sturdy shape? Is it to bring the size down? Is it to open a dense plant to lighten air? Is it for fruit production and access? Your reason for pruning will largely determine what kind of pruning you will be doing. Next, do the research on the particular plant to decide when is the best time to prune, based on the plant itself, but also on what kind of growth response you want. Now here, this is a really important thing to remember. Dormant pruning, when you prune when the plant's dormant, anytime during the late winter, very early spring, results in a strong growth response from the upward rush of all the sap that was stored in the roots the previous fall. That's what happens every spring. All that sap that was stored goes whooshing up into the plant to make new leaves for the plant. So when you prune when it's dormant, when nothing's happening, then the growth response is going to be, you're going to have a huge growth response. But summer pruning results in a subdued growth response because the plant hasn't the sap reserves to put out a big flush of growth. So if you want to just do a little tidying up or cut some branches and open the inside out, but you don't want to have a big flush of growth, pruning in the summer can be really helpful for that. A lot of fruit trees will be pruned when they're dormant, but also again in the summer. And Japanese maples, I like to prune those when they're dormant because I can see the branch structure really well. But then in the summer, I will prune again because I won't have that big growth response. For those plants that are pruned right after blooming, like forsythia, for instance, remember that a flush of growth usually occurs right after blooming, and that's whether you prune it or not. That's just the way forsythias grow. The flowers come out first, and after the blooming is done, then the flush of growth happens for the leaves. So consulting the RHS pruning groups for your particular plant will also help you decide when is the best time to prune. So you're going to start the actual pruning with the 4Ds. This means you cut out all of the dead and dying branches. On some plants, it is hard to distinguish dead and dying wood from living, so waiting until bud break to prune may be necessary. And dead branches can actually be removed anytime you notice them, any time of the year, doesn't matter. The next D is diseased, and that's to remove the disease from spreading, to prevent the disease from spreading to the rest of the plant. Next, we have damaged branches because they can be a pathway for rot and disease to get into the plants. And lastly, we have the deranged branches, which is what I call branches growing in the wrong direction, out of proportion to the rest of the plant, or damaged or crossing and rubbing on other branches. Here is a plant with a disease called black knot, which needs to be pruned out at least 10 centimeters or 4 inches back into healthy wood if possible. Now, if you've got something like this on the trunk rather than on a branch, it's going to be more difficult to control it. And this Douglas fir has a fungal disease called needle cast, which is also handled by cutting off the infected branches. Here is a small tree with a couple of deranged branches. They're a little bit hard to see, but I hope the arrows will help. They're both originating over on the right, but then they're growing across the middle of the tree toward the left. The tree, and this tree is in my neighborhood. It's like a half a block away from my house, and I walk by it all the time. And I have this fantasy of coming out at night and doing a drive-by pruning and just cutting off those deranged branches. Okay, and the other, this other one is let's see. The tree on the right is a great example of deranged branches, curling and looping and tangling. These should have been pruned out when the tree was small, but it's still not too late to do so. Now, sometimes you might find a growth pattern like this kind of interesting. Japanese maples will do a sort of a looping thing with their branches and everything. But it's okay as long as you don't have so much growth. You're blocking all the light and the air movement in the inside of your tree, and also that things aren't rubbing against each other. Now here you can see the beginning of wounds in the picture on the left where the branches have been rubbing, and that's the spot up at the top that's kind of darker brown, and then there's another spot under the crossing branch. These are ideal spots for disease to enter. And then the picture on the right is of a Japanese maple with a tangle of crossing and rubbing branches that is in dire need of renovation pruning. This tree has been let go for a long time without any sort of pruning, so it's kind of a tangled mess at this point. After the 4Ds, open up the whole plant to light and air using branch removal cuts. Okay, and you've seen this picture before, and this is the same kind of thing you're going to do. You're just going to stand back and look at the plant, and you're going to take out, using branch removal cuts, any branches that will open the plant up to light and air. Light will help prevent dieback in the interior of the plant, while airflow will help prevent diseases from getting a foothold. Now, this is a lovely Hollywood juniper pruned by Bliss Garden Concepts of Gig Harbor, Washington, showing the results of opening it up to light and air. I think this is a lovely example. Now, when you first look at the picture on the left, you think, well, that's beautiful. And it really is. But it's not as healthy for the tree as it could be, because you're going to have a lot of dieback in the interior, and branches lying on the ground like that, that's also not good for the tree. So this has all been opened up, and you can even see there's some interesting branch and trunk structure in the interior that you can now see. Finally, you're going to prune for shape, using mostly, if not all, reduction or branch removal cuts. The goal is to prune with a focus on what will remain rather than, what you're taking off, and to maximize the inherent traits of the plant. For example, if its natural form is a vase shape, then use pruning cuts that will maintain that shape. Remember that non-selective heading of trees is never appropriate, and only appropriate for shrubs if you want a formal manicured look. This is another tree in my neighborhood. It's a Japanese maple. And it just makes me sad every time I walk by it. It just gets lollipopped every year. And when the leaves are out in it, it is a solid mass of leaves. And I call those kinds umbrellas. They just look like an umbrella. And that's not the normal growth habit of a Japanese maple. And it just is sad, I think. Here's another tree pruned by Bliss Gardens again, this time a Japanese maple that was restored to its beautiful shape after years of neglect, which had resulted in the solid umbrella look we so often see in these beautiful trees. Okay, the picture on the left is before anything is done. The picture in the middle is during, and you see that the first thing they did was starting from, when you prune a Japanese maple, you start from the bottom up. And you lift the tree so that you don't have branches lying on the ground. And you work from the bottom up and from the inside out. And you clear out all the excess crossing, rubbing, and branches that are blocking light and air. And then the picture on the right shows the results after they were all done pruning. I wish that this was on Instagram, I found this. I wish their page had shown a picture of this tree leafed out the next year, but it didn't, so it's too bad. But the other nice thing about opening Japanese maples in particular up like this is look at the really interesting trunk and branches on this tree, which you can now enjoy all winter when the leaves are gone. One last word of caution: do not paint the wound with anything. This is opposite of what we were taught in the past, but research has shown that painting the wound just seals in moisture and/or pathogens and can lead to rot. Proper cuts will result in the branch collar closing the wound. Here is a large wound that was sealed with some kind of paint, and when the paint was peeled off several years later, the trunk was full of decayed wood and fungi that will eventually kill the tree. Actually, whenever you see any kind of a tree that has these fungi growing on them, that when I was a kid, my brother and I used to call those ears. We'd be playing out in the woods and we'd find a tree with those and we called them ears. Those, that kind of fungi right there only grows on dead wood. So if you have a tree with that growing on it, that part of the tree is dead. And if you look at this as well, this was a big, big cut. This was way bigger than recommended. So between the size of the cut and covering it with paint, it was just a too bad because it probably killed the tree. Okay, the last type of pruning we're going to look at is multi-stemmed shrubs and cane growers. These are done differently than trees. These are plants that send up new stems from the buds on the top of the root ball every year, such as hydrangea, spirea, ninebark, elderberry, etc. Starting from when they are fully established, they should have the oldest 1 to 3 stems removed as close to the ground as you can get every year. Leaving stubs, so that's why I'm saying as close to the ground as you can get, leaving stubs is unsightly. They will probably send up weak shoots, and if they die instead, then they are a pathway for disease. Removing the oldest ones keeps the center of the plant open to light and air and makes room for the new, more vigorous stems that arise every year, which is the plant essentially renewing itself. These plants can also be tip pruned or selectively headed back to rein them in if they get too big and floppy. And if they just get too big entirely and you want to start over, many will respond just fine to cutting the whole plant right to the ground. And I've done that in the past. We had a big mophead hydrangea when I was a kid, right out in the front yard, kind of in the grass. And my dad used to mow that thing down every year, and everything, it came back beautiful and bloomed like crazy. So multi-stem shrubs, once they're established, are pretty forgiving. Now, if you look at these pictures, the one on the left is sort of a nondescript multi-stem shrub, but I like the way they've illustrated what they've cut away. They've got the sort of the ghost stems and things in the background. So you can see the original plant. They cut off one main stem in the center, and then there's a bunch of tiny little weak stems at the bottom that they just cut right at the ground level. And then they headed back a bunch of stems at the top, sort of to make a better shape for the plant, but also to rein in the size a bit, I think. And the plant, the picture on the right, looks to me like a blueberry. And when you go through and look at this, fourth year canes, those were the original canes from when the plant was young. And then third, second, and first. The first year cane, that's it. This is the cane that sprouted from the ground the last growing season. And that first year, it's usually just like a whip with little buds on it. Second year cane shows that those little buds from the first year are now branches. And the third year cane, each of those branches now has little branches. So those were kind of left. And the fourth year canes, which were the original old ones, and you can always tell the older ones, the bark usually looks different and they're bigger. So one of them was removed completely right to the ground, and the other one, part of it was moved in a branch reduction cut. See how it took the bigger part of it and left the smaller one? That's to bring the size down a bit. Now you've got room in the middle of the plant for new first year canes to come up and for air and light to get in better. Also, as these canes get older and older, they just don't produce as well. So it's better to keep letting that plant renew itself. Now here is a physocarpus or a ninebark in my garden before I pruned it. And here is after I pruned it in early March, and then after growing all summer. As you can see, I brought the height down to about 3 feet, maybe a little less, and thinned out about half of the branches right down to the ground. As I expected, it grew back to about the same height it was before pruning, but if I didn't prune it at all, it would eventually grow to 8 to 10 feet tall and wide with densely packed stems and be much too big for the space. Now, one thing I learned pruning my physocarpus, because I didn't look it up ahead of time, because I got in a hurry, is that this one blooms on last year's wood. So one year I cut the whole thing right to the ground, and the next year I didn't have any flowers. So I learned that the hard way. Here are my 2 favorite books on pruning. Cass Turnbull was the founder of an organization in Seattle called Plant Amnesty, whose purpose is to educate the public to prevent the malpruning of trees and shrubs. Her book is great for beginners. It's full of helpful diagrams. It's affordable because it's paperback. It's entertaining and cleverly written. Now, the other book, Pruning and Training by Christopher Burkell and David Joyce, is more technical and with a lot of information, as well as tons of pictures and diagrams. This book is also a great reference for how to do structural pruning on young fruit trees to train them for a sturdy shape, if that's something you're interested in. And this picture right here is of the newest edition that just came out just a few months ago. This has been a very basic.
Sorry to interrupt, Deborah. The library has both, and I've dropped both of the links into the chat.
Excellent. Nice. Thank you. This has been a very basic introduction to pruning for aesthetics using methods that maintain the health of the plant. There is much more to learn, especially regarding best practices for specific plants, training young trees, pruning to control size, fruit production, and more. Now that you have this basic information, you will be able to research whatever else you need to know. I would like to leave you with this summary thought for guiding your pruning. In a nutshell, your goal should be to prune to natural form so your work becomes invisible. So if you prune something in your front garden and your neighbor walks by and goes, "Oh, you just pruned that." That probably means that you did something to the natural growth habit of the plant to make it obvious that you pruned it. But if nobody says, "Oh, you just pruned that," it just looks really good, then you know you pruned it to natural form and your work is invisible. So good luck and happy pruning. And I love this cartoon. Okay. So any questions?
Can we do the ones out of the chat that didn't quite make it into the Q&A first so we don't lose them?
Sure. I am going to stop sharing my screen if that's okay, because I feel like I'm talking to the
The slides.
well, there we are. Okay.
Great. So
Yes.
the first question that happened in the chat from earlier in your presentation was how can you correct a tree that's been pruned in a non-selected way? Basically,
Um,
how to correct bad pruning from other people,
yeah.
possibly you.
Well, yeah. Yeah. That's called renovation pruning. And depending on the plant and how badly it's pruned, it can take several years to get it back to where you want it to be. It's really hard to renovate bad pruning all in one session or one season even, because it depends on how many mistakes were made, what kind they were. If you're unsure what to do, and it's a plant you really value, I would recommend hiring a certified arborist to have a look at it. And particularly if you have an old fruit tree, like people have old fruit trees that they really want to save, and if they've been badly pruned, an arborist will do a good job on that. Barring that, do some research on renovation pruning. There's lots of good resources out there, but bear in mind that it could take several years to get it back to its original growth habit.
Okay, so renovation pruning, those are the words that we're using
Yes,
with this basic knowledge. Now we're going into specialized knowledge. I'm
yes.
sure almost
Well,
everybody has
you're
something that could use renovation pruning, hey?
oh, for sure. You're still going to be using all the techniques I taught you tonight, the cuts and all of that stuff. It's just that you can't do it in one session. You often can't even do it in 1 year. It'll take several years, depending on how bad the damage was and how wrong it was pruned. So, yeah. Okay.
Darby is doing such a good job in terms of the chats. You had that lovely picture of a Japanese maple that was pruned so beautifully.
Mhm.
In relation to that, other than was it pruned all in one go, the other question is, can you prune a Japanese maple more than 15 to 20%?
You can, yes, that was pruned all in one session, and it was pruned while it was dormant. You can prune anything up to 25 to 30, which we've been recommending for a long time. But be prepared for a really strong growth response, especially if you do that when the plant is dormant. Because if you think about taking a quarter of the branches in the tree away. And then you've got that big surge of sap coming up from the roots in the spring, and it doesn't have as much tree to go into. It's going to cause really a lot of growth. And if you don't want that, if you don't want all that big surge of growth and new branches growing, then don't prune as much. Prune only 10 to 15%. And that, by the way, the 10 to 15%, 20 to 20, 35%, that's in a growing season. So you can do 10% while it's dormant, 15%, and then maybe try another 5 or 10% in the summer. See how that works when you won't have as much growth response. You're probably
Along
not.
those lines,
Yeah.
there's a question that also goes into the pruning. It says, I've been told that summer pruning of fruit trees is best to control growth. Would this be the best time to prune water shoots?
Yeah, it would. Now, remember that water sprouts happened because it was pruned too much the last season. Water sprouts are the plant's response to trying to put back what was cut away. And if more is cut away than the plant, it's like the plant gets worried. Oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to produce enough food, so it needs to put out a whole bunch of branches. With water sprouts, the best way to handle that is the first year you go along the branch, you've got a branch usually this way, and then you got all these water sprouts growing up. You take out one of every three and you cut it off right to the branch, cut it right to where it is attached. And if you take out the weakest ones first, and then next year you're going to take out half of them, so that eventually you're going to be left with just one out of every three water sprouts that you started with. Okay. But if you were to just cut them all off, they would just grow back. And the tree is trying to be its genetically predetermined size, and it's trying to replace its food factory. So you have to kind of, go slow and trick it a little bit. Yeah. If you only prune 10 to 15% each year, you're much less likely to have the water sprouts to deal with later. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's a recurring question, isn't it? There were several questions along those lines, but I think you've done a good job in answering them. There's also an interesting comment from Christine that says, I'm currently taking the Fire Smart BC landscaping course, and they pointed out that incorrect pruning by non-selective heading cuts creates plants that are more susceptible to ignition due to the thinner branches with higher density. Just another reason to avoid it.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you think about it, it's just like a big brush, which is just like a fire starter. There's not, because there's no air spaces and the branches are tiny, so they're going to ignite really quickly. Yeah. I'd never really thought about it that way, but that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Okay.
And then there's a question that I think you'll be hard pressed to answer, and it is, do you have any insight on who specializes in cherry fruit tree pruning in the RDN?
I do not, but what I do know is any certified ISA arborist will know what to do to prune. Now, the other thing I know about stone fruits, which are cherries, apricots, peaches, nectarines, plums, is that they are all more susceptible to funguses than other fruit trees. They grow really well in the Okanagan because their air there is drier and they don't have the fungus load in the air like we do for about 10 months of the year. So it's not like you're going to kill your trees if you prune them in the winter. But if you wait and prune those stone fruits in July and August when the air is dry, you run much less risk of the fungus problem. But any certified arborist will know what to do. Just make sure that they're ISA certified and not just, I'm a tree guy kind of thing. So,
And a new question came in. I have a Dutch honeysuckle that's thriving to the point of where it's pulling down the trellis over with its weight. Any advice?
well, it's a multi-stem shrub. I suspect a Dutch, I'm not sure about a Dutch honeysuckle. If I'm not familiar with that particular one, but all the honeysuckles I know are multi-stem shrubs. And if it's just plain too big, and boy, they are vigorous plants. I think you'd be hard pressed to kill it if you wanted to. you could just cut that right back to the ground and start over. And if you decide to do that, I would recommend letting just a few stems grow because it'll send up a lot. Again, treat it like a multi-stemmed shrub and thin out the older stems every year and keep just, a few and then it won't get overwhelmed. I have a honeysuckle hanging over my back fence that's planted in my neighbor's yard and it is a mess. And 2 years ago, they got out there and sheared the top of it. And I don't know these people, so I feel like I need to go knock on their door and say, would you like a little help with your honeysuckle? Because they're so vigorous. They're just crazy vigorous. So yeah, cut it to the ground. I would. You're not going to kill it.
I don't see any more questions at the moment. Lots of thank yous because it was a lovely presentation. But Darby, do you see any more questions?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't
It
either.
was lovely.
Ginger, do you have any questions? No? Or
Ginger
so many
hasn't been-
questions that you just have to get out there.
Ginger hasn't been watching all of our presentations for 3 years, so she's still a newbie.
Ginger
I was taking notes on the blueberries. I was just looking at my blueberry plants, and I
Yeah.
need to go in and take out some of the older.
Yep. And this is the
canes.
time of year to be doing it.
Great.
It's even a little early. You could even wait until, end of February, early March if you don't want to get out there in the rain or the nasty weather. But yeah.
Any excuse to get out there, I'm
Yeah.
happy to get out in the rain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's one about pruning raspberries. It's asking.
Depends on the kind of raspberry. The kind that are only bare for a few weeks in June. Okay, raspberries send up a new cane every year. The old cane from the year before is the one with the berries on it. Once the berries are all done, that cane dies. So that one can be cut right to the ground and gotten rid of. The new canes that have come up all season while the berries were ripening, those are the ones that are going to bear next year. So I go out there in the fall and I kind of clean everything up and I tie up or stake the new canes that are going to bear the next year because I don't want them lying on the ground all winter and all that. So, and I've done some experimenting. I've both let them grow their full length and they're all floppy and like this and hard to find the berries and pick and they make a big tangled mess. And I've also cut them off at about 4 feet and let them branch this way. And it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I've got the same amount of berries doing it both ways. It just depends. Now my berries came under the fence from my neighbor. So they're in a corner in my yard and they're really kind of hard to get at. But if you have your berries in rows and they're all tied up nicely, that's so much easier for picking. And then it's easier to just let them grow their full length and pick the berries off the whole thing. Now the everbearing, that's a whole different animal. Those are ones that bear across the whole year. And Dorothy, you might be able to help me a little bit with this one. I've never grown them, but I know that when they first come up, they'll bear. And then they send up another, the stem continues to grow. Am I right? And then that stem bears berries. Is that how that works, Dorothy? Do you know about that?
I wish I could answer that. I find it very difficult to sort of make up my mind as to how those ever-bearing raspberries work. So I'll leave that one alone.
Well, if that's what you have, the kind that have berries on them for the whole season, just do some research and you'll be able to find how to prune them.
I suspect that the cast Turnbull, try that again, Turnbull book is a very good one to look at for that.
Yes, it will be. And you can order that book online. You can either get it from Amazon or you can order it directly from Plant Amnesty, the organization in Seattle that she founded. She founded that organization about, 40 years ago, 35 years ago. She died about 10 years ago, very unexpectedly, but the organization has continued on. And I've actually taken their whole series of pruning courses. It's just a wonderful organization. And the whole City of Seattle Parks Department has gone through all of their classes so that they're now pruning properly for all city property and plants and shrubs and trees. It's a wonderful organization. So go look at
And
their
all of a sudden, a whole bunch of questions pruning lilacs.
pruning lilacs. Okay, I I'm not 100% sure. I know that usually it's a multi-stem shrub. So you're going to cut out the oldest ones. Lilacs can get tall and leggy and really ugly. That's because those are the old ones. I think if you prune out the old stems and leave the newer, vigorous ones to refresh the plant, you'll do well. I'm going to recommend you look that one up on the Royal Horticultural Society website. Look up the pruning group for lilacs, and it'll tell you exactly how to cut and when. I know that you're going to do it after blooming. I do know that. And you're going to cut off the dead heads. Yeah, those pruning groups are so helpful if you just get into the habit of always looking those up on their website. This is a gardening society that's been in Great Britain for what, 100 years? It's a lot. It's a very old established society, and there's a lot of gardening knowledge there. And they're the ones that developed all these pruning groups. I especially like the ones for roses because there's 8 different types of roses and they're all pruned slightly differently. So you don't have to guess. Just look it up. You don't have to remember either. Like I don't remember all of those. So, okay. Any other questions?
Well, there's one about when should you start pruning blueberries?
Now, or clear into maybe the 1st of March.
Or how old is the bush? When
How
you-
old? Oh,
Yeah.
probably 3, maybe 4 years. Once
Oh,
you've got the original cane, because they usually will start with just one cane. Once that original cane is big and the trunk starts to look kind of different than the others, it'll look kind of gray. And you've got all these new canes coming up and the plant's starting to look crowded. Then you want to cut that, get that old one out of there because they're not going to bear as well. They start to get kind of tired. Let the new young canes take over. Yeah. Yeah, let the plant get well established first for a few years.
can I ask a lilac question, Deborah?
Sure.
You know how they send those shoots under the ground because they're going to take over your whole yard?
Yeah.
Do you have any hints for getting those?
Take an
I find
axe.
it very
Next.
probably a good idea.
I don't know. I've only ever grown an actual lilac once. And I think if you can put it in a place where the roots are going to be a bit constrained, like my daughter has one growing right alongside the driveway, and then there's a fence, and then I don't know what it's doing under the fence in the neighbor's yard, but it can't grow under the asphalt. So yeah, some plants are just so vigorous that
Yes.
they will just do that. Yeah.
Yeah, even if you do a bad pruning job next year, it's a whole other thing with them.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it is. Yeah, they're just it's like a wisteria. They're really hard to kill. My sister had one in her yard they wanted to get rid of, so she cut it right at ground level and even a little below ground level, and then put a black tarp over the 3-foot square over the top of the root ball and pinned it down to the ground and left it for a year so that anything that tried to sprout would come up and die, and finally did kill it. But some things they're just so vigorous. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we just have one left. When
Okay.
is the right time to prune cherry trees?
Summer, July and into August when the air is dry. When the air is dry, you don't
When
have
the
we
air.
don't have the same fungus load in the air, and funguses need particular conditions in order to attach and start to grow on plants. And they need a certain temperature, they need a certain humidity in the air for a certain number of hours before they can attach and start to grow. And if you can disrupt any of those things, then you'll have much less incidence of funguses on all your plants. But the fungus load in the air is less in July and August than it is the rest of the year because our air is so humid or so damp all the time. You don't realize it, but funguses are everywhere all the time.
Mhm. I think that's all the questions.
Hey, look at that. It's just about 8 o'clock. Well, I want to thank you, Darby, for letting me do this presentation again.
They're
I just,
totally different presentations, actually.
Yay, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. I just have been taking classes and studying this for several years, and I just feel like I learned so much more, and I had so much better grasp on how to teach it. And Dorothy gave me a piece of advice a couple years ago. She said, you need more pictures. So I've been really working to get more pictures in there because they do help. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, just a plug for your first one. I think that they're both good companion pieces. I would encourage people to watch both because the first one you did, you actually put in videos, and you're
yeah.
still the only person who's done videos in
Oh,
one of these
yeah,
presentations, which I know is a lot of prep work. So
yeah,
if you want to see
yeah.
pruning in action with Deborah, you can watch that one. We can drop that into the chat too.
Yeah, go ahead and watch that one. That one was pruning a couple Japanese maples, which is something I really love to teach people how to do. So, but I think the information in this one was probably more coherently presented and more completely presented than it was in the first one. So, anyway, yeah.
They were both amazing.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you for all the preparation and for sharing. And thank you, Jill, for your assistance in coming to your first
Yes.
virtual
Yeah,
gardening
thank you.
workshop here.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you to
Okay.
everybody who
yeah.
came. We're going to post the video in the next few days. Depending on the processing speed, video takes a long time to edit just because of the size of things. But we do send it out through Eventbrite, so you don't need to hover to look for it. It'll then be on YouTube and then on the library's website, so everybody can enjoy them.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Awesome.
Great. And please do head to the library's website, virl.bc.ca/gardening, and then you can register for the other sessions if you haven't done so. And that's also in your Eventbrite links as well.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for
Thank
attending.
you, Deborah.
Thanks.
Thanks. That
Good
was
night,
a
everybody. Happy
Bye.
pruning.